Thanks for joining us here at the Conduit Club, those of you who are in the room and those of you who are joining us online. I'm Chris Morris. I was a BBC correspondent for a long time, possibly even longer than Martin, but not from quite as long ago. But I left the BBC last year. I still do some broadcasting and hosting events like this. We're going to have a fairly standard format this evening. I'll get both our speakers to say a few words and we'll have a discussion. Anthony Seldon is on his way. He's late. I don't know why he's late. He may well be writing another book because he hasn't written it for at least 2 months. So, but he is on his way and will be with us fairly shortly. We're going to talk today, as you know, about politics and sleaze and scandal. We know it's not exactly new, and so I guess one of the things we want to explore is it worse than it was before? Another thing we're going to want to explore is what are we going to do about it? I think it's fair to say that our kind of on-front-line media grid has been a bit of a triumph this week because we wanted to try and schedule a scandal on every day of the week, and we appear to have succeeded. So that's been most gratifying. Thank you, politicians, for that. Let me introduce the panel. Martin Bell probably doesn't need much introduction, but of course a BBC legend, certainly a big inspiration to me when I was a young foreign correspondent. But probably more pertinently for this event, he was of course the independent MP for Tatton from 1997 to 2001, after standing at the last minute against the scandal-plagued Neil Hamilton. I'm sure many of you remember that. And since 2001, when Martin left Parliament, he's spoken quite a lot about politics and sleaze, and I guess standards in public life more generally. Zoe Grünewald is with us. She is a political correspondent with The New Statesman. So she strides around the corridors of Westminster so we don't have to. Previously you were Special Advisor at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Yep. And I've only just learned just now a parliamentary clerk. Yep. So you've sort of done all sides.
I'm part of the blob.
You're part, well, I didn't want to put that because we do need to talk about the blob a little bit later. So I'm going to get Zoe and Martin both to speak for a few minutes to begin with, then we'll have a discussion and of course we'll take questions and we'll involve Anthony when he gets here. I think I'm going to ask Zoe to start because you've been there this week. What's happening, why is it happening, and who's next?
So just a short opening then. So yeah, it's been another really hectic week in Westminster. So yeah, I'm a political reporter, so I do stroll around Westminster sniffing out scandals, although mostly they're falling into our lap these days. It's, if it's not the Home Secretary, then it's the Deputy Prime Minister. If it's not the Deputy Prime Minister, it's the former Prime Minister. It's kind of seems to be kind of consuming everybody at the minute. There are, Parliament that are really interesting to me personally. I used to be a parliamentary clerk, so I had a really interesting insight into the way Parliament operates, all the kind of quirky things that kind of make our parliamentary democracy great, but also very strange when you're working in it. And that gave me a real insight into, how Parliament is so old and it's steeped in tradition and it's, archaic, and that can be really great. But I think also does contribute to a lot of this kind of sleaze and misconduct hiding in plain sight. I think it's also really important to say, there's been a lot of kind of scandals. In politicians has really declined, but there are some brilliant MPs. There are really quite a lot of brilliant MPs, and there are still brilliant, reporters and special advisors and everything as well. So I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking it is a, cesspit of sleaze, because that isn't the case. But I do think there needs to be a really serious conversation about standards in public life, how they're being upheld, and whether the systems are in place that keep everything above board.
And how much do you think it's to do with incumbency? Because obviously, a lot of the scandals at the moment are Conservative ones, but it's not just about the Conservatives. I mean, you can go to Scotland, who's been in power there for a long time, who is embroiled in various financial scandals. Is incumbency the key thing, that power corrupts?
I think after 13 years of government, you're going to have fractures in the party. And I think what we've seen, especially with Sunak, for example, is I do believe Sunak does believe in accountability and transparency and integrity. But I think what we've seen is that he is a divided that has made it quite difficult for him to really, really stamp out some of those difficult parts of, the party and some of those bits of sleaze, legacy sleaze that have, kind of been handed over with him. I don't think power corrupts, and it shouldn't. We have a parliamentary democracy, we have a functioning free press, we have standards, we have brilliant, clerks and special advisors who are supposed to keep things ticking over. But I think, any time you have power, you're going to have some people who abuse it. So we just need to make sure that there are systems in place that stop those abuses from happening. And you've got some brilliant parliamentary committees. We're seeing the work of the Standards and Privileges Committee at the minute, doing a really good job. But I'm not sure. It shouldn't be that incumbency, creates corruption. It shouldn't be at all. But I think mechanisms aren't quite working, and you have a government that isn't quite able to stamp it out.
Martin, I guess it's easy to say 'twas ever thus, but how would you compare then and now? The major years, the sleaze you stood against?
I think the principal difference is that back then, the MPs accused of breaking the rules were mostly backbenchers. My old antagonist, Neil Hamilton, was sort of famous once for being the Spectator's Parliamentary Wit of the Year. He was a junior minister, but frontbenchers were not involved. So that was one difference. The other was that all was also ever thus. I'm fascinated by what's going on with the Standards Committee at the moment, because I served on it for 3.5 years. And there's an awful lot of stuff going on in the right-wing press about the kangaroo court. Well, it's so far from being a kangaroo court. Its danger is that it lets its mates off. And if you remember, this is exactly what Boris Johnson tried to do with the MP for North Shropshire. On the committee I served on, there was actually, I think I can name him, there was one Tory MP, the late Eric Forth, who didn't believe in parliamentary self-regulation at all and cast his votes accordingly. There were at least three on the Labour side, I won't name them, who were, one of them is now a peer of the realm actually, who did not park their party allegiances at the door. And because there were many more Labour MPs in the Parliament I sat in, 97 to 2001, many more of them got into trouble. And they were senior, quite well-known MPs. They gave us the most difficulties. Keith Vaz was one, John Reid was another. And they gave enormous problems to the then Commissioner for Standards, Elizabeth Filkett. People tend to forget, she was the second Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. This was a role introduced after the sleaze scandals of the early 90s. And she did her job so well that they let her go. There are things you don't enjoy doing in life, but enjoy having done. In mine, being a soldier, and conscripted soldier was one, and being a member of Parliament was another. But I think what strikes me most is that about the differences between then and now is that now there is an ever more hostile media landscape in the cause of people who are trying to do their job properly, whether journalists or MPs. Back then it was, of course, the right-wing press was always the right-wing press. It still is, except that I think I sense a slight drift to the right by the Times since the arrival of its new editor. I may be wrong. And there is also the arrival of these new right-wing television channels. You actually have so-called news programs on GB News hosted by Conservative MPs. And the question I want to ask is, what on earth is Ofcom doing? It has slightly tapped on the wrist, GB News, for promoting anti-vax series. But these MPs, one of whom is the MP for Tatton, in fact, the country is teeming with former MPs for Tatton. She's sitting. There's George Osborne, there's Neil Hamilton, and there's myself. And the only one of them still in politics in any sense is Neil, who is the head of what remains of the UKIP party. I rest my case.
Well, so Neil Hamilton is therefore the great survivor of British politics. When you went into, at very short notice, to that election campaign, and you subsequently served as an MP for 4 years. Did you ever have any sense that it was going to be the beginning of there being a kind of anti-sleaze movement in British politics, or was it always going to be a one-off?
I think that at the time we did a lot of good. I found it very strange when I got in the House of Commons, the lack of any sanctions against an MP not doing his or her job. You can be elected to the House of Commons, you take your oath, and you can disappear to the Caribbean for 4 years and nobody can do anything about it. There is no punishment for being bone idle. And I got letters, I got a lot of green ink mail. I got letters from all over the country, one from a despairing voter in Lincolnshire. They couldn't find their MP, he'd gone missing. I said, sorry, there's nothing you can do about it till the next election. And one of the things that interests me about modern politics is the increasing sense in which people are voting tactically. I was part of the AV campaign. I believe that proportional representation is much more democratic. We had no chance against the right-wing press. But people have worked it out for themselves. In the North Shropshire by-election, I actually got a call from somebody quite high up in the Lib Dems, sort of harking back to what happened in Tatton in '97. Didn't actually ask me to stand, but said, how about it? Can we repeat that? I said, look, I'm so old, I wouldn't even vote for myself. What they realised now, that the parties can stand, they can make informal arrangements with each other, and and you've seen it in the local elections. So I think in that sense things are better, and we, the people, can take back control. But the press is our enemy where it should be our friend, or most of it is. And I do believe that Ofcom has to do something about this dreadful neo-fascist channel.
Zoe, you mentioned, and I think it's right to stress that, there are plenty of good, hard-working MPs who are not scandal-ridden. But is Parliament as a whole bothered by the image that it has? How aware of it is, or is there a bubble into which you enter and those outside pressures seem to disappear? I mean, MPs go back to their constituencies every week, right? They must be aware of some of the strength of feeling, but does it have any impact?
I think MPs are very acutely aware of the reputation that Parliament has. I think part of the problem, though, is that we're increasingly seeing...
Oh, that's better.
Okay,
good. I think part of the problem is that we're increasingly seeing, actually, a number of MPs who are making it their kind of brand to disrespect Parliament. And I think we've seen that through the way that they've spoken, certain MPs have spoken about the Privileges Committee, for example, calling it a kangaroo court, or, Johnson's decision to try and prorogue Parliament to, squeeze through Brexit legislation. That can be seen as, leadership, but it can also be seen as disrespecting the democratic, the democratic process that is there for a reason. When you have a really powerful speaker, they should be able to prevent that or hold, ministers to account. So we've seen, recently Hoyle chastising a number of ministers because they've made announcements to the press before they've made them to the floor of the House, which is, it's parliamentary precedent. You shouldn't do that. But, like Martin was saying, there actually aren't that many things that Parliament can do to actually punish them. And, we've seen, Johnson lying to Parliament, or, allegedly lying to Parliament, and we've seen this inquiry, I should say, allegedly lying to Parliament, inquiry ongoing, how long it's taken. And actually, they can recommend a suspension, but that still has to go to the floor of the House. If you have a Tory majority, they don't, and if they are all very supportive, they don't necessarily have to vote it through. So there are lots of things in place that can prevent that from happening. So I think, also, you've seen several MPs now, they're talking about the blob, they're talking about these kind of weird, obstructive forces that are trying to stop them from doing their democratic duty. And I do think a lot of them are codedly talking about Parliament as well. So I think we need to be really aware that there does seem to be this creeping rhetoric that Parliament is actually obstructive, the civil service is obstructive, and that's not healthy for democracy. And they like to frame it that it's their democratic duty that's being impeded, but those processes, they might be annoying, but they are there for a reason. It is a democracy. So, and I think there are a lot of MPs who are really worried, you speak to them, they're really worried about this creeping narrative, and a lot of Conservatives are worried about the way their colleagues are talking about Parliament and the civil service. And, you know, you've got some really great MPs, you know, Chris Bryan, or you've got the Speaker, you've got Harriet Harman, you've got lots of MPs who are really big on, you know, select committees and, you know, taking things to the floor of the House. But if everybody doesn't play ball, there's not a lot you can do. And, you know, I think as well, a lot of people now are conflating sleaze by individual members as a problem with politics and members as a whole, and they're starting to see Parliament as part of that. So that's why this blob rhetoric, I think, is really hooking, because people just think, Westminster, it's not for me, they all lie, can't trust anyone, journalists, MPs, anyone. And I just think that's a real shame. You know, it's like one bad apple spoils the lot, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it just erodes trust in politics in general, doesn't it? I mean, Martin, talk to me about the civil service, the blob. I mean, it strikes me that if it's true that senior civil servants are actively trying to bring down the government, that's disturbing. If it's true that they're not trying to do that, but other MPs are saying that anyway, that's also disturbing.
What is disturbing is the attack.
That they are. That shouldn't even be put. It's an outrageous suggestion that civil servants are trying to bring down.
It's not a suggestion I'm making, sir. It's a suggestion that it has been made, as you know. But
yes, by whom? No one of consequence. Anyone of any serious consequence. That's nonsense.
Let Martin answer the question. I hear you, sir. Thank you.
Every time I see a headline about the woke blob, I cringe, because it's a cover-up, it's an attack on every democratic defence that we have got. Can you imagine a more difficult job in public life than being the permanent Undersecretary in the Home Office at the moment? The previous one resigned, alleging bullying, and was handsomely paid off by us, the taxpayer. The present one, Matthew Mycroft, I think, is doing a brilliant job. But it's a tough one when you're being sniped at by the press all the time. And it's the same suspects, the Telegraph, it's the Mail, the same ones going on about the kangaroo court. I wish our press were more free than it is. But
it's not just the media, though, is it? I mean, Boris Johnson has been, we now know, is being investigated again by the police for alleged breaches of COVID rules. And friends of Boris Johnson say it's a stitch-up, it's the blob. So it's not just the papers doing this. There are people within the political system creating the image of the blob.
I would say it has always been thus to some extent. I was forever being approached by friends of John Reid, friends of Keith Vaz. He had some friends. And they wouldn't approach you directly, but they got their mates to do it. And as I explained, she brought down the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. And I think another reason why politics is perhaps even in more disrepute now than it was then is the fallout of the expenses scandal, which we haven't mentioned yet, which had a huge impact. One of my favourite stories concerns the John Selwyn Gummer, who's a blameless individual. But of course, he required us to pay for the clearing of his moat in his stately home. Well, later he took his seat in the House of Lords quite properly, and his son, I think Ben Gummer, then stood for Parliament in the Ipswich constituency. And this is why you can't make it up. He was defeated by a Labour candidate called Chris Moat.
One thing that was not around, obviously, when Martin was an MP was social media. And I wonder, Zoe, I mean, it amplifies everything, doesn't it, good and bad, and it often can be a real cesspit. I wonder whether the sense of permanent scandal is something which modern social media, rather than some of the traditional media that Martin has talked about, but the social media is amplifying it, and there's a problem with that.
Yeah, I think obviously we all know how social media has contributed to mass disinformation. But I think, you know, because media has to adapt to social media, you know, traditional print media, we are, you know, as journalists in the lobby, you are running around, you're trying to get a scoop, and when there's a sniff of a story, everyone's on it. You want to be the first person to tweet. You know, you're in an embargoed lobby briefing and you're there, everyone's writing their tweet, and it's the first person to press send. You know, it really is a really heightened atmosphere, and I think that kind of constant 24-hour news cycle, and people, if they're interested in politics, they don't just follow one journalist, they follow 15, 20 and all the major broadcasters. it does look like it's constant, because it is, and everybody has a take, and everyone's getting anonymous sources, you know, senior Tory MP told me this, and it does make it really, really frantic. And I think, you know, there is a danger that sometimes these scandals, and, you know, I think, you know, I do believe there is quite a lot of scandal in Parliament, and we really need to think about how we're stamping down on it. But I do think sometimes these things get blown up a lot at the expense of policy, proper policy scrutiny, at the expense of, you know, the hard work and proper legislative scrutiny. You know, we've talked a lot about Suella Braverman, but not a lot about actually the detail of the immigration bill and what it's going to mean for, you know, people. So I think, you know, sometimes that can come at the extent of actual, I don't want to say proper journalism, because I do think it's important to draw attention to these things, but I think, you know, proper scrutiny of policy, which is actually what politics is really about, isn't it?
He's here.
Anthony Seldon, welcome.
I was just crawling in without anyone noticing.
Well, we've noticed. Welcome. I'm sure you all know who Sir Anthony is, a historian, educator, biographer of multiple prime ministers, and I was going to allow him to get a breath for a couple of seconds, but seeing as he's now sitting down, we've obviously been talking about parliamentary sleaze in the past, and in Martin's era as an MP, currently. I wonder, given the latest book you wrote, how much you think the current woes we see in politics are down to the rule of Boris Johnson.
So, good evening, everybody. And I didn't slip in unnoticed, but I wasn't being paid for what I'd just been doing before. And look, I'm an educator and a historian, and it really matters, and we have to stop being coy about ethics. I mean, it really, really matters that people try their best to be honest and to come into public life and serve. And as someone spent their life in schools and latterly in universities and now back in schools because the head of the school I'm in at the moment was murdered with her child, and they asked me to go in. I mean, conduct matters, and it matters in a democracy, and democracy is on the run in the world. And, you know, people say, I was on an interview this morning about Boris Johnson, I was saying, you know, he fundamentally was not honest. A prime minister, any body in public service has to be good in two ways. They have to be good at their job, and they have to be good human beings. They have to have a sense, an innate sense of what goodness and truth means. It doesn't matter which party they belong to, it matters that they serve. And then they're going to give good example to others, they'll encourage other people to join, and we can have a democracy that we can be proud of, that can start performing at a much higher level. I do think Boris Johnson, to answer the question, has damaged the standard of public life, not just him, but to have somebody as Prime Minister, the most dignified office, elected office, not obviously directly elected as Prime Minister, but elected as an MP and then elected by the MPs, to have somebody in that job who was fundamentally frivolous and could not take anything seriously, and who gave no trust to other people, wanted trust back, but his actions were so untrustworthy, has been a significant dent in public life. And yeah, I think it matters, and I think it will take time to recover. And I hope the good thing about it is that it will bring us to our senses, because democracy is precious, and there is no reason to think that Britain will still be a democracy in 50 or 25 years' time. Look at what's happening in the United States. Somebody who over 50% of his party want him back in, and he has trashed the very foundational principles on which his republic was founded, which is honesty and a belief in the democratic process and the outcome of general elections. So we can say it's fanciful to say that democracy is under threat. I don't think it's fanciful.
Anthony, when you came into the room, we were talking about social media, and you described Boris Johnson as essentially frivolous. Social media strikes me as being often an essentially frivolous form of communication. So I wonder whether he is not almost the inevitable product of his age.
Okay, that's a really good question, and there'll be lots of different views on that. No, I don't think it is. I think that going all the way back to ancient Rome, or coming back through the 18th century, I was running on the streets to get here through 18th and 19th century London, that it was full of the media of the time, full of cartoons and rhymes and gossip and salacious stories. I don't think that social media is qualitatively different, in that it might be quantitatively different. Obviously it is, because it's ubiquitous. And all the more reason, therefore, for someone to prevail above it. No, social media did not explain Boris Johnson at all. It does not justify Boris Johnson. We need to be having people with integrity, and we need to stop thinking that integrity is an old-fashioned word. Aristotle said that education is about character or it's nothing. The government thinks education is about tests and exam results or it's nothing. It rejects a third for failing the system, and they're the ones at the bottom of the tree anyway. So of course we need to have integrity. We need to stand up for it, not be ashamed to stand up for good human values, and not think it's a middle-class notion. It's not. You try saying that in countries where you can't tell the truth.
Martin, would you broadly agree with that? I mean, there are those who would argue, I suppose, that in a country where there is less and less deference to authority, more and more people are going to break the rules. But I guess they don't necessarily assume positions of power.
No, I absolutely agree. And I also agree that there are many MPs of great value and integrity right across the House. On the other hand, sometimes I think that it is that looking across the green benches now, I wonder if in many cases the principal qualification for becoming an MP is ambition. What I find is increasingly the way up the ladder is to leave a university and join a political party machine, become a SPAD, and as in some cases you can inherit a safe seat by the time you're 28 without much real world experience. And I think that's very important.
I'm going to come to questions from the audience at the moment, so if anyone has, I just want to ask Zoe to pick up on that. It's an interesting point about the kind of people who become MPs, and both the main parties, in a way, the way they select their MPs is quite tribal, isn't it? And as Martin says, in a way, on both sides, they're sort of professional politicians. A lot of union people and party workers on the Labour side, a lot of people from central office on the Conservative side, not exclusively, but is there a way that we can get a wider spread of people actually into Parliament? Is that potentially part of a solution?
I think the first thing is to think about what sort of person would look at Parliament, walk into Parliament, go into the chamber and think, oh, I feel really comfortable here. I feel like this is somewhere I would be comfortable. I don't feel like that. I think if you have grown up in an environment and you have been, gone to the likes of Oxbridge and you have done debating society, then you might look at the halls of Westminster and think, that fits perfectly for the sort of person I am. But that breeds a certain type of person. It doesn't mean they, are necessarily bad at their job by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Parliament needs to modernise. The hours that Parliament sits, it sits till 10:30 on a Monday night. And, there's arguments for that, people getting back from their constituency, etc. But that doesn't allow for carers, working mums, people with disabilities. And I think we don't have a very diverse Parliament at all at the minute. There are definitely issues with selection, and we're seeing it playing out with Labour selections at the minute, and to some extent with Conservative selections, where there is definitely some top-down control of the selection process, and that happens. But I also think it actually comes earlier than that, and it is about why people would feel they want to go into Parliament, and as you say, what they want to get out of it. And I think Parliament needs to get much better at being accessible. I think it needs to get much better at going around the country, touring, letting children in, you know, things like that, where it can actually get anyone from any side of the country thinking, oh, I could be a politician. And, you know, it starts with things like PMQs. I mean, not many parliaments in the world have that adversarial chamber where people are shouting and jeering at each other and booing each other. You know, you look at Scotland, look at Sweden. I mean, you know, there are different ways that you can set up that kind of process, and I think that's one of the first things. But yeah, I think it starts much earlier. I think it's about making Parliament look accessible and making anyone think that they can be an MP.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that one thing PMQs does is make people notice Parliament, whereas in Germany, for example, I think at one stage they were trying to think, should we do something similar to generate interest?
Yeah.
Questions? I know we had one here. Have you got a microphone at the back? I'll take this one here if you could do the one. Yes, I'll hold it for you.
Oh, thank you very much. The theme when we started is about sleaze, and I've always thought, not always, but, you know, of the recent months and everything that we're looking at in the papers, there's something about the sense, particularly with Johnson, entitlement, you know, Etonian entitlement. Because I went to Eton, because I'm now entitled, I can bloody well do whatever the hell I want to. And there's that kind of sense, that arrogance that I find absolutely the dismantling of the kind of democracy you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. Entitlement. Yes, sir.
I think central to all this, and it's something Anthony whiffs on in his book and confirms for me all my worst fears, is the alignment of the right wing of the Tory party, the sort of dissident right wing of the Tory party, and the populist part of the Republican Party. And they've been very close. Boris Johnson has enough social nous to know that quite a lot of people across the board in this country feel a bit iffy about Trump, and very iffy if they were to see him about Steve Bannon. But in private, they were close. And as Anthony points out in his book, the security services advised against getting too close to Steve Bannon. But like a lot of other bits of sage advice, Johnson rode straight through that. And if you see, there's a documentary made by an American documentary maker which shows Steve Bannon saying, I co-wrote Marvellous Boris's resignation speech, meaning his application speech. The American populists have taught a certain kind of Tory, you can just drive through that fence.
Yeah. Is there a question you want to ask? I mean, it's a valid comment.
Well, do people agree? Is the absolutely precipitating moment the American example?
I mean, the other quote I always remember from Steve Bannon is that he said that if you spread enough shit, then the media is never going to notice the important things because they're too busy wading through the shit. We'll come to you. Yes.
Can I hold it?
Hold it.
Okay. I have to make 2 points. One is about women and the fact that it's a threatening environment. When I look at Jo Cox, Stella Creasy, I'm not going to go into that, we know that. And it's one thing to encourage people to come into it, but I think more and more women would not want to take those sorts of risks. But I'm an Australian. I grew up under the Emperor of the world, who changed his nationality so that he could take over politics and media in America. And when Trump over dinner said that he was going to run for president, apparently Murdoch turned to someone and said, oh, he's an idiot. And then he realised how much disruption could be caused. And that's what he mainly says. I hope we're under Charterhouse rules or something here, because one of his famous sayings is, I don't ever want to go in the front door of number 10. I want to go in the back and be heard. And a lot of the things that happen in social media, and I agree with what you're saying, how it's taken off, but it just takes a little bit of stirring. Tony Blair went to have an interview with him on the island, won the election. So you need Lindsay, I've forgotten his name, how terrible. You need Rupert Murdoch and Lindsay, who put Boris in the mayoralty, because that's what he does.
Okay. So I guess the role of the media, entitlement, Anthony.
So I think entitlement is at the very core of the rot. I see our democracy in this country and democracy in the West as quite frail. And I do not see enough determination to try and solve it. Entitlement rots, it rotted the Boris Johnson premiership from the very heart. People who thought, I mean, it's unimaginable. By dint of the school they went to, or the university they went to, they had some God-given right to rule over other people and not to do the work, not to put in the hard work, not to care. As Peter York was saying, you will take bits out of Trump if that's going to play to your advantage. If human beings, look, I've just been giving you a talk about AI. What's the difference in human beings, human intelligence, and artificial intelligence from machines, which is developing exponentially, unlike human intelligence? It is that we are principally moral and social beings. And if we forget that, we are sunk. I completely agree about women. Also, I've dedicated 2 books to Jo Cox. She was my complete hero. She was that rounded, compassionate, open human being. She was a fantastic role model to young people, people of all ages. And what happened to her? And there's so much violence. We have to be very alert, very wary. And, you know, I'm talking as an educator, we need to get our young people interested in politics and public service for the right reasons. Because actually it's a really good life. And to serve other people will make you happier than anything else. It'll make you a lot happier than making a lot of money or being around rotten people.
Zoe, do you want to pick up on the issue of women? Because I remember when we talk about scandal, it's often financial scandals or bullying, but there's also obviously the issue of harassment, pestminster. I mean, do you find it an intimidating place to work?
Yeah, definitely. Short answer, yes. It is an intimidating place to work. It's an intimidating place to work for 2 reasons, really, or several reasons, but I'll go in on 2. The first is what I touched on before, which is that it is just feels like a boys' club. You know, it is the bars on the estate, you know, even the procedural rules. You know, I used to be a parliamentary clerk, but some of those seem to me very archaic and like they could be modernised, you know. Some parliamentary documents are still written in Latin and Norman French, you know, and I don't know about you, but I don't speak Latin or Norman French, so it feels, you know, it does have a feeling of being quite elitist, quite boys clubby, and there's definitely a sense sometimes that you just don't but then there is also a problem, which is that sexual harassment is an issue in Westminster, and it still is. You know, it's a difficult thing because well, I don't want to say every young woman, but most young women have a story of a time they've been harassed in Westminster. A lot of it occurs in the bars, but not all of it. Some of it is, you know, more subtle than that. One of the things that I think is really important is that Parliament still does not have a process in place where if an MP is under criminal investigation for sexual assault, he can, or she can still attend the estate. There are no protections in place to stop them from coming into contact with staff. Now, the House of Commons Commission is looking into this, and we are hoping that they will put a procedure in place or put it to the floor of the House that members will be forced to stay away from the estate. But it hasn't been the case, and Imran Khan, who is now in jail for sexual assault, was able to attend the estate for a division. You know, so you know, staff don't feel safe. Women don't feel safe. And, you know, there are female MPs who have stories of being assaulted by colleagues, you know, who have been to the police. Cases are dropped. Some MPs are very lawyered up. You know, it's a well-known, there is a whisper network of names. You know, I have been texted a list of names to avoid. You know, it's not by any means I'm not saying that, you know, you should be wary of everyone, because of course that's not the case, but there is definitely a problem with stamping out sexual harassment and misconduct in Parliament. And I think there are several really brave female MPs who are trying to do it, but it's an uphill battle. There are lots of vested interests. And I think the media is doing a good job at pushing against that door, but it's hard and it comes in waves. I mean, we saw it with the Me Too movement. You have to keep pushing, and you need a few brave women to stand up. And we've seen that. But there will, you know, it's ongoing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sadly not unique to Parliament, but it does seem something about the culture there which needs to change. Martin, can you pick up perhaps on the idea of the media that famously, you know, Blair and Campbell decided they had to get Murdoch on side to win the election, and that sort of almost primordial power of the media to affect politics?
I think the power of the media now is at least as great as it was in the 1990s, and also that the media landscape, as I was explaining, is more malignant. And I think the rise of the internet has something to do with it, the sheer nastiness of much of these communications where the fingers move faster than the brain, if the brain moves at all. And there is a general sense of menace, I think. Not just Joe Cox. Look at what happened to David Ennis. I mean, a public figure, you stand very little chance. I got a death threat too while I was at MP for Tatton. I didn't take it seriously, but the Cheshire Police certainly did, and their whole armed response unit was out in force polishing their guns. At that point, I thought, where are we going? And I'm still wondering where we're going, and I think in some very nasty directions.
More questions. There's one here, and then if you could pass the microphone behind you. And the other mic. There's questions at the front. Yeah.
Mine goes back to social media. I think the Boris situation with all the Partygate showed it. How much do you think that the fast pace of the media, how much do you think that the fast pace of the media stops MPs and leaders and anyone in Parliament being held accountable? We've seen it literally this week, a new story every week, which kind of means they get away with then not holding accountable to the previous story. I know the only reason Partygate probably came up so many times is because it happened so many times. And if it had happened once, we may have brushed over that because of our media.
Okay, and the lady behind you, and then gentleman here.
So I'm interested in what we might do to change things.
Yeah.
And something positive to look forward to. And I'm sure there are many, many ideas, but one that you might throw out there is, should we be paying MPs more? Would that solve any of the problems?
A couple of questions. You mentioned the Whisper network. I wonder whether that also extends to, let's be blunt, MPs who one way or another are on the take, one way or another. Is there a similar Whisper network then? My second question is, how do you think the press or media or MPs themselves could talk more about all the constituency work that they do, which you never see referred to at all?
Okay, so media on the take and constituencies, and
paying people more.
And paying people. And thank you. Should MPs be paid more? Anthony, do you want to go first?
So I agree that we should be looking for solutions. I mean, we have to have hope, because otherwise we'll just be, leave here and go home just thoroughly depressed and wake up tomorrow thoroughly depressed. We have to find hope, and hope and optimism are self-fulfilling, and they generate ideas and they generate energy. I think that it's down to us. It's down to young people like you and me. That wasn't very nice. But I mean, I spend my life amongst young people. It is because we can only look to ourselves to generate it. They are, to some extent, the reflection of who we want. People like Murdoch and the Barclay brothers and Paul Dacre and the Rothermeres, who are massively decisive in the outcome of this general election coming up, as they were in 19, as they were in 17, as they were in 15, as they were in 97, when Tony Blair went right across the globe to the Hayman Islands to see to see the Rupert Murdoch clan and to do a deal which included not speaking up for the EU, so no one spoke up for the EU. And so, yeah, but we buy it, we consume it. We need to democracy came about because of direct action of young people. Look at and people of all ages. Look at the levelers in the 17th century. Look at the democratic movements in the 18th, and the Chartism in the 19th, and the movements amongst women, the suffragettes, and amongst the unions, leading to the extension of the franchise. We have to teach our young people about democracy, and we have to ensure that the really rotten people, and I completely agree about the news cycle also. I mean, look at how Trump has evaded these appalling sexual, deeply depraved allegations. Look how he continually bounced off, because people don't want to know that. Or so I think that optimism, teaching politics, and honouring people who having rules, certainly paying them more, it could be a solution, but recognising more the great people who do stand, and there are so many fantastic people across. We were talking too much about Labour and Conservatives. There are lots of parties in Parliament at the moment. There are great people in those parties, and we need to celebrate them more than we do at the moment. Not wait until David Amos, who by the way was a very nice guy, a very good human being. That was partly why it was so sad. It doesn't matter about his politics. Just say Joe Cox, not to wait till they die. We need to. Democracy perishes when good people remain silent. That's what happened in Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah. Martin?
My mind goes back to my previous career. I've been ambushed 3 times in my life, once in Vietnam, once in Bosnia, and once on Knutsford Heath. And what's important to me is steadiness under fire. Defense of democracy and holding back the tyrants is always going to be a difficult task. I remember, I wasn't there at the time, but when the House of Commons burned down in the 1830s, the then King, William IV, took it as the punishment of God for the passing of the Great Reform Bill. We've only had universal franchise a little over a century. It was always difficult. It always will be difficult. But if we stand back and say they're all crooks, that doesn't help, because they're not.
Sorry?
Yes, I think I would agree with both points. I think, something I think is really important, and this was something that parliamentary staff are really trying to do. And by parliamentary staff, I don't mean the staff who are working for MPs. I mean the thousands of staff who work in Parliament and are public servants and help MPs do their job every day. There's an amazing engagement and outreach team there that are really trying to do the best with the resources they have to make Parliament more accessible to everyone around the country. I think getting young people involved in politics is really important, but I also think making sure people don't turn against democracy or Parliament or Westminster or the civil service because of a few bad apples. I think, the civil service can't really defend itself. It can't speak to the media. And I think these attacks on the civil service's integrity, I was a civil servant and everybody I worked with was brilliant. I didn't know the political leanings of anybody I worked with. And, I was working in, on the BBC licence fee, which is a really emotional topic for a lot of people, but I didn't know the political leanings of anyone. And I think it's really sad when MPs and the media are attacking, an institution that does so much for everybody every day and can't defend itself. So I think we really need people to stand up for the institutions that can't speak for themselves. I think outreach for young people is really important. I think, for example, the Labour Party are talking about votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. I don't think that's a bad idea, because I think trying to get young people involved and feeling like they have a say in the future of this country is really important. And you basically create a generation of voters who feel that their voice is heard and feel that they have a stake in society. So I just think we need more outreach. We need, MPs to be interacting with their constituents as much as they can. We need them mentioning their constituencies in Parliament. We need people feeling like they are heard. And I think a lot of this erosion in trust in democracy is because people see Whitehall and Westminster and they think, it's nothing to do with me. They just think nothing's working, it's nothing to do with me. And, why would I vote? Why would I stand up for this?
Yeah, which is the point you were making about why don't we see more about constituencies. I just want to pick up on the other point you made about MPs on the take, if you like, and turn it around. There are plenty of people who want to give to MPs. I mean, there are problems around the people who may want to influence all party parliamentary groups. We had, I guess, the scandal last year when the Chinese in Britain group was closed down after MI5 revealed that the woman who had basically funded it was a spy. In the European Parliament, we have the Qatargate scandal, where Qatar has been pouring enormous amounts of money, allegedly, into the pockets of certain MEPs for influence and power. How do you get around that? How do you get around the people that want to sort of play the system and harm the system, who have very, very deep pockets?
Well, John Stuart Mill talks about two kinds of reasons why our behaviour might be moral. One is because of inner conscience, because we just want to do what is right and good and true, and the other less good way is because of fear of exposure and fear of sanctions. I guess we need both, and we need an ever vigilant press and media to spot what is happening, but we also need to nurture it amongst our young people. Sorry to talk about schools, I spent my life amongst them. The morality, the sense of service, duty, and schools has been stripped out in the relentless search for better and better exam and test results, which, by the way, is also fueling the mental health crisis amongst our young, but that's another story. I think, look, my children have gone into public service. They're not done it for the money, so I'm always worried that we think that by paying people more, you have to pay them enough, sure, but actually people doing it feel enthused and they feel excited to be doing something, for goodness sake, worthwhile. I mean, look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People, a much bigger motivation than reward is that sense of personal effect, the sense that we are doing something that is worthwhile, and we have to make these jobs worthwhile and honourable. I totally agree about the civil service. I mean, to have the guy running, the Prime Minister as the chief executive, to let things appear in the press that there is a shit list of top heads of departments who are going to be culled by Dominic Cummings and his brigade, to have the decline of language, so that everybody was who they didn't like in the number 10 coterie around Boris Johnson, they were described as an epithet beginning with the third letter of the alphabet, which had and everybody was that, or they began with the sixth letter. I mean, that decline, and some of those people are still at the heart of the Rishi Sunak. Not good human beings, bad human beings at the heart of power will corrupt and rot it, because there will always be. There were in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, Assyria. There will always be, and as ditto in China and India, always be bad influences. We have to nurture goodness within people from the very early age, but also have those external sanctions that keep people within a certain parameter.
Any thoughts? We'll come to you. Any thoughts on, in particular, I'm interested, Martin, you obviously were on the Standards Committee, and I think the Standards Committee at the moment is trying to tighten up the rules for how all-party parliamentary groups are funded, for example, because there is concern that there are just too many people trying to buy influence.
And I also want to hear about Martin in Vietnam. How did you get out, Martin?
Yeah. We'll come to that later.
We'll come to that later. I see nothing wrong with lobbying. I spent 4 years lobbying or being lobbied. I even lobbied on behalf of the salt industry because I had 2 salt mines in my constituency. I was lobbied by people all over the place. It's when money changes hands. And before we go back to the Owen Paterson scandal, we actually had a concerted attempt, I would even call it a conspiracy, dreamt up in the Garrick Club to change the rules in such a way that he would get off the hook. Nothing as flagrant as that happened while I was on the Standards Committee, but it can happen at any time, and it's very important to have the right people on the committee, and I honestly think we have at the moment. And I think Chris Bryant did a great job recusing himself. He would have been a prime target for the Kangaroo Court Brigade. It depends on the quality of the MPs, and you couldn't in my time be on the committee without first being elected. So it is up to us to elect the better sort of person.
Okay, there's a question there, and I'll give the microphone around here.
Thanks. So, can we have some names of these role models? Who's actually doing a fantastic job across, the different parties that who should we be celebrating right now that isn't in the limelight? That can help to change the way people feel about the parliamentary system.
Zoe, that's for you.
We'll just take one more question and then we'll...
Thank you. So I want to build on this idea of give us some hope in amongst all of this. So we've talked about several things that seem to be a fix, including maybe paying MPs more, a less adversarial approach in Parliament, other aspects that have come through. One of the things that cropped up early in this discussion was proportional representation, how people are elected and how votes count. And I felt that there was a very gloomy prognosis about the hopes of that. So my question is, what would need to be true for proportional representation to be here, delivered?
Okay, so Zoe.
I'll pick up on the first question. So some MPs that spring to mind for me as particularly impressive. So Caroline Harris is an MP in Wales, and she came into politics, she would say quite late in life, as a campaigning MP. She's done some amazing work campaigning on menopause and support for women in workplaces, and she will say she is a campaigning MP. She has worked on she's worked on gambling awareness, menopause support, and also food banks. She still organises a lot for her local food banks. She is a pure constituency MP, and she has 3 big issues that she campaigns on. And I think you can see she's really committed to them. And actually, when the New Statesman did its Positive Impact Awards, we named her MP of the Year, campaigning MP of the Year. Another couple of MPs I would say who are really good, and you might have seen them in action in select committees, is Darren Jones, who is chair of the Business Committee, who has done a brilliant job at holding businesses to account over poor practice. So you should watch him in practice if you haven't, because he's a brilliant example of proper parliamentary scrutiny, questioning real CEOs, heads of business about their practices. Including Royal Mail and Amazon. And then the last MP I would mention, because I don't want to be too biased by just mentioning Labour MPs, is Caroline Noakes, who is chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, who has always stood up for her principles. She hasn't been consumed by the culture wars within the Conservative Party, and she's another great select committee chair. So those are 3, I mean, there's lots of others to mention, but 3 I would say are really standout MPs.
And why don't they attract more rapid advancement? Maybe they don't want it. Maybe the constituency work is more important to them.
I think, 2 of them are select committee chairs. I think, being committee chairs is a hugely important part of parliamentary democracy, and, they do it extremely well. There are issues that are very important to them. I think Caroline Harris is quite new. I think I'm not sure what intake she was, but she's fairly new. And I think, she said to me, I decided to become an MP because I just wanted to bring these issues to a public stage, and what better place than Westminster? So, sometimes it's not all about climbing, to the echelons of power. Sometimes it's about the issues and democratic scrutiny. So I think they do it very well.
Yeah. And Jo Cox was another great example of that.
And her sister.
Her sister Kim, yeah.
Anthony,
Kim Ledbetter.
Proportional representation, I don't know what your view is on it, but would it give more people a stake in the system and therefore improve our public discourse?
So as a politics teacher, did anyone do politics A-level here? Hands up. It was a standard question, and what are the arguments for and against proportional representation? And I used to think it would never happen and not be a good thing, but I've begun to think. Obviously the big problem is it removes from the electorate the composition of the government because of the coalition after the results are in of MPs, of people joining together and making coalitions. But I think that anything that's going to increase the participation of people would be a good thing. So I think some kind of halfway system. I think it was a pity that the ideas that came out of Lib Dems were voted down in that AV referendum in 2011-12. And I think there are lots of good people across, in Wales, up in Scotland. They don't have to get to the top. Sometimes they drop out altogether. Chakra Moona was a very good person. Sam Jima, who was the first black person to be in a position of influence in Number 10, were very good people. Wes Streeting, I think, is really interesting. And for Deputy Prime Minister, David Lidington was just a decent, honourable human being. You always know, because they're liked across the House. The good people are liked by the other side, all sides. And they're known to be, fundamentally trying to pursue the truth and trying to get to the heart of what is right.
Martin, it's interesting. We know that the Conservative Party does not support PR and electoral reform. At the Labour Party conference, there was a motion in favour, and yet it's pretty clear that Starmer and those around him don't agree with that. What was your experience from being an MP? What's your view of a system which is obviously, and there are different sorts of systems, and they're in play in Scotland and Wales, but what's your view of what it could look like?
Well, looking
nationally?
around here on the great benches, what struck me was that more than half of the 650 members were voted by less than 50% of their constituents. The extreme case was a Lib Dem, Michael Moore, who represented a border constituency, who I think got in with 32% of the vote on a three-way marginal. Now, it's much better for the MPs themselves to know that they have the support of the people. The people want them there. And coalitions do work. The Irish always have a coalition. The Germans have a coalition. It works for them, and I think it can work for us. And I just hope we can get a more equitable system than the one that we have. Having said that, I was elected with 62% of the vote.
Other questions? I have a couple. Anything at the moment? One thing I wanted to ask about was
Vietnam.
Vietnam, obviously. Yeah, go on. What happened, Martin? You've got 30 seconds. Well, actually, that's a bit unfair for being shot at.
If you're ever driving up a road in some foreign country and you come to a village with no people in it and no chickens either, then you're in no man's land and you get the hell out.
I wanted to ask about, obviously we've been talking about political sleaze, but in the context of a more general loss of trust in public life. I mean, I just wonder, is it more important that the Prime Minister is a good role model than Marcus Rashford is a good role model? Where should the role models come from? Because they don't just come from politics, do they? And there can be pressure from below to change as well as pressure from, an example set from the top.
So who do the schools teach about? They teach about Nelson Mandela, they talk about Gandhi, they talk about just about anybody other than a British politician. But it's important that we do have some who we can admire. And of course, it's great to have Marcus Rashford. It's great to have people across the whole media, of television, of film, of music, of fashion. But we also need to get those people. And I just think at the moment we do have a very mechanical, plodding kind of politician who's coming up with 5 points. And it would be great to have somebody who could set people's hearts alight with a vision. I mean, the great leaders do two things of any party in any country. One, they tell a story. They have a convincing story to tell. And secondly, they are healers. And we don't have healers, and we don't have people who lift, and that's the difference between a leader prime minister and a manager prime minister. And whoever wins the election next year is likely to be, of the two main parties, a manager, and they're just competing at that and that's not really enough to inspire people at this really critical moment with a vision of why democracy matters. Why have people died for democracy? Why does it matter in Ukraine? What are they fighting, giving their blood for? What is it that they're afraid of? And here we just seem to want to watch quiz shows and not get engaged. I do think so much goes back to education, and I think so much also goes to getting that good example of people who can really show. And of course, Blair was responsible for Iraq, and that did massive damage on trust. He was, whether he lied or not, he was believed that he'd lied over Britain committing that war, and as a result of that, hundreds of thousands of people died.
It's interesting you talk about storytelling and the importance of that. I mean, my last job at the BBC was as essentially the BBC's chief fact checker, and one thing it taught me was facts are really important. They're kind of the basis of our political system, and yet sometimes the people who don't care about the facts are still telling better stories. We saw that with Donald Trump. He was a better storyteller than many of his opponents. So it just strikes me that
he wasn't a healer, though, was he?
He was certainly not a healer, but it just strikes me that the people with the facts still need to tell better stories. I mean, honestly. Martin, Zoe, you're both storytellers, you're both journalists, or a former journalist. I mean, what's your view of the quality of public information at the moment?
I think it's pretty dire.
So do I.
Our newspapers are vehicles of opinion rather than fact. Foreign news has virtually disappeared apart from Ukraine. I mean, what's happening at the moment in Khartoum is of importance right across the world, in this continent, where all these hundreds of thousands are going to come. I noticed for at least the first 2 weeks of the war, none of the Western media, none of our newspapers, none of our television networks had anyone who got further in than Port Sudan. Now, in the old days, you had to. The hell with health and safety. It was your job to do things like that. I think we are underinformed. There's too much emphasis on celebrities and Hollywood nonsense, and Harry and Meghan, especially Harry and Meghan. Anthony and I both contributed to a book about reporting royalty, which I'm going to ask you about later. Wow. I do remember once in the Cayman Islands, I wasn't allowed to ask the Queen anything, but I came across the Duke of Edinburgh in a wildlife reserve, and I asked him why he was in favour of conserving wildlife abroad while shooting it at home. His book look alone would have sent me to the Tower of London.
Zoe,
Yeah.
public information.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to your question about social media and how, good that's been for news, because I think, something that I really have to grapple with as a political reporter is that not only do you have to write your copy, but you have to present it in a way that people will want to read. And people are, flicking through their phone. They just want to read it, 140 characters or whatever. Everything it's no longer, just enough to print the facts. They want you to have a voice. They want to know why they come to you for news instead of someone else. And I think, that sometimes means we tend to go more to commentators than we do to reporters. And, commentators are great for, presenting news in an entertaining way or giving the opinion if you think it's someone who you're aligned with. But I think often people are confusing the two, and we're not always getting the facts. You're getting the facts through somebody's very specific lens. I think social media, has been really good for making news more accessible. So many young people, used to just get the news from reading their parents' newspaper or having to sit through the 10 o'clock news. But now, everybody's, on TikTok or YouTube or whatever. But it does also, we also have the issues of algorithms which push certain, stories over others, and it makes the source much more questionable. So we have to be really careful about where we're consuming our news. And I think everybody needs to make sure they have a mix of, products like the BBC. And, you can have your favourite commentators, but making sure everyone's getting, accurate news at the same time.
We've got about 5 minutes left. So if there aren't any other audience, there is one question. There's one at the back as well. Let me just...
There's one there.
Behind you.
Okay, I'll let this gentleman here first. You've got the other mic.
Thank you. No, I mean, there's lots of reasons why we should be very concerned. I completely agree. I just had two reflections. One is, and maybe for you, Anthony, as a historian, there's always been sleaze. There's always been corruption in politics, including in the sort of glory days of the late 19th century, and think of Lloyd George, etc. And so are we actually just seeing more coming to light? Is that part of why this sense of crisis is building? And the second one would be to reflect on the fact that the Tory MPs in the end had enough. And they did show some backbone in the way that the Republican Party obviously has failed to do so far in the US. Does that give us any cause for hope? I wondered if you could reflect on that.
Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting to hear what everyone's had to say, but relating to what was part of the discussion earlier as to who would want to be an MP, I wonder who amongst us here would want to be an MP, and then also, and this is a very important thing, how many of the people here are actually part of a political party, whichever party it might be, so that they get involved in the process. And interesting point. I would genuinely like to know which of you are members of a political party and actually get involved.
Okay, well, let's have a show of hands. How many people actually are members of a political party? Not bad.
Yeah,
I suspect that's probably above average, but I think your point is well taken in the sense we get the MPs we deserve, I suppose, and if you don't get involved in the system. The question here, Anthony, was partly addressed to you about...
So there are two questions there. I mean, one is about sleaze. So we always think, don't we, that things are worse now than ever, and things are always new, and that scandals are worse and more depraved. But I mean, Boris Johnson was so like David Lloyd George, Prime Minister exactly 100 years ago. They both lived in Downing Street with their mistresses 25 years younger than them, with other women were around. They both nearly died of the epidemic at age 55. They both were mired in financial scandals as well as sexual scandals, and had staff in their private offices whose primary job was to keep the people like you, Zoe, at bay, and not very effectively. I mean, but you know, of course he was sleazy. Let's go back to the first Prime Minister of all, who was Robert Walpole. I mean, the sleaze is just momentous. I mean, there was more sleaze in one day in Walpole's life than Liz Truss could ever dream of, or indeed Boris Johnson. So, you know, going all the way back through history, sleaze and politics, sleaze and power will always be side by side. It's always new. And then, so that was the question there, is it new? Absolutely not. Is it even worse now? No real way of knowing. I wanted to ask Zoe whether politicians were worse than say, business people or others in their behaviour, and if they are worse, is it because there's something then about politics, the kind of people we attract into politics, or the way of life that they have? But we always have to do better. And then, you know, and then the revolt against Boris Johnson. I mean, how on earth do you lose? I mean, no one in history has lost a landslide victory like he won, or well, he and Jeremy Corbyn won the landslide for the Tories in December 19, and the notion of getting Brexit done also. But he lost that. I don't think, I'd love to feel that it was an inspiring and moving revulsion by Tory MPs against the endless lying. I mean, you need moral people, because moral people will immoral people will always equivocate because they've got no basis. You can't have people running schools unless, you know, they're at least trying to get it right. Of course, we all make mistakes, but unless they're fundamentally trying to get it right. Boris Johnson wasn't interested in getting it right. Boris Johnson lied morning, noon, and night. Boris Johnson didn't even know when he was lying. Boris Johnson had no concept of duty, no concept of the truth. So it wasn't a revulsion against all of that, even though that was no worse than lots of other prime ministers of the 56 before him in history, 54 before him in history, all the way back to Walpole. No, it was they were worried about their own skin. And they came to realise that if Boris Johnson, the opinion polls were dipping after Owen Paterson, after Partygate, after Chris Pincher and anything else beginning with P, but let's move on quickly from that one. That anything else, you know, that it was simply they were going to lose if they carried on. And anyone, yes, audience, even Liz Truss, would be preferable because she was more likely to win the general election. That's why the herd shifted. Not principle, self-preservation.
Seeing as you mentioned, I did want to ask, your Liz Truss book's going to be quite short, isn't it? Is it a pamphlet? Or?
Honestly, I'm trying to walk across Europe to the Ukraine front line at the moment. I've just had it, you know. I think I've just had enough. I mean, Boris Johnson was so disheartening. I said, but there were good people, there were great people in Number 10, great people in the civil service, some great politicians, great aides, great journalists, but unless the guy at the top or the woman at the top is fundamentally honourable and has a sense of honour and purpose, moral purpose, no.
Okay, Zoe.
I'm going to interrupt, if I may. One question.
Briefly.
Best Prime Minister of the 20th century, please.
Okay, well, I would say, and this is going to be unpopular with some people, the best wartime Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, and the best peacetime Prime Minister was Clement Attlee. I mean, Clement Attlee, what he achieved in just...
He was Deputy Prime Minister, he was active Prime Minister for much more of the Second World War than people realise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he had an experienced team. Look, the 5 prime ministers up to Boris Johnson, between them, had worked in just 3 departments. The 5 before that had worked in 23, and the 5 before that in 43. That's an incredible collapse. By the way, those departments were May in the Home Office, Gordon in Treasury, and Boris Johnson in the Foreign Office, although it's arguable that he actually worked in the Foreign Office.
So, experience. Martin and Zoe, final thoughts, and something positive, because I think, as somebody here said,
yes, we something to believe
how do we improve standards? We know that we've got some problems. What are the, give me 1 or 2 pointers. What should we do to improve standards in public life?
The first thing, we absolutely prevent the unique British corruption, which is the sale of peerages. That's all we need to do. £1 million for a political party guarantees you a nomination. It may have started with Lloyd George, but it's going on now. We have to end it.
Good point. Okay. Zoe.
Just on your point about scandals and whether they've gotten worse, it just reminded me that a Tory MP stood up in the chamber the other day talking about Suella Braverman's speeding fine and said, genuinely, dead seriously, we used to have proper scandals in this country. As if that was some kind of, ringing endorsement. Anyway, I think we need to stand up for the blob. I really do believe that. I think civil servants can't speak for themselves, and MPs need to stand up for them and the good work they do, and people need to be aware of the work the civil service does and realise that, it is an institution that is really trying its best.
Hear, hear.
Anthony, any final one positive thing that
No,
needs to happen?
I love that.
A good place to stop.
And as a result, everyone here tomorrow morning, turn up at 9 a.m. in Parliament. We're going to boot the lot in there out, and you lot are going to take over.
Well, there we go. That's a perfect place to end. Thank you very much for coming in. Thank you to our panel, Anthony, Zoe and Martin.